March 14, 1944. Lieutenant William Anderson crouched in a muddy ditch 30 miles inside Germany, watching smoke pour from his B-17 Flying Fortress as it burned in a field half a mile away, and all he could think about was how quiet everything had become after the chaos of the past hour. The bomber had taken flak over Bremen, lost 2 engines, and started spiraling down through the clouds while his crew bailed out one by one into enemy territory. He'd pulled his ripcord at 5,000 feet, hit the ground hard in a farmer's field, and spent the next 3 hours moving through the German countryside trying to avoid patrols. Now, hiding in this ditch with his service pistol and a torn flight suit, he was supposed to be running west toward Allied lines. But something caught his eye that made him stop and stare. 300 yards to his left sat a small Luftwaffe airfield with a single Focke-Wulf Fw-190 fighter parked near a hangar, the distinctive radial engine cowling gleaming in the afternoon sun. No guards visible. No mechanics working. Just one German fighter sitting there like someone had left the keys in the ignition. Quick thing before we continue. Hit subscribe if you want more incredible WW2 stories like this, because we're building something special here and you'll want to be part of it. What Anderson didn't know was that in the next 18 hours, he'd steal that German fighter, teach himself to fly it while taking off under enemy fire, and use it to strafe 12 separate German military convoys across occupied Europe, turning his desperate escape into an offensive operation that would destroy hundreds of trucks and kill or wound over 400 German soldiers. This is the story of how one B-17 pilot turned disaster into Germany's worst nightmare using their own plane against them. Anderson had been flying B-17s for 8 months, completing 23 missions over Germany, and he knew bomber controls like he knew his own name: throttles, trim tabs, engine mixtures, all of it second nature after hundreds of hours in the cockpit. But he'd never flown a fighter, never handled a single-engine plane, and definitely never touched German equipment with instruments labeled in a language he couldn't read. The smart move was heading west on foot, trying to reach American lines before German patrols found him, but as he watched that Fw-190 sitting unguarded in the fading daylight, something in his mind shifted from survival mode to opportunity mode. That fighter had guns, ammunition, fuel, and the element of complete surprise, because no German soldier would ever expect an American pilot to steal one of their own planes and start shooting up their supply lines. He'd either die trying or make it count. He waited until dusk started settling over the airfield, then moved low and fast through the grass, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat, expecting German voices to start shouting at any second. The Fw-190 looked bigger up close, the engine cowling massive compared to the sleek fighters he'd seen in training films, and when he climbed onto the wing and pulled himself into the cockpit, he found himself staring at a control panel that might as well have been written in ancient Greek. Everything was backwards, everything was labeled in German, and the instrument layout made no sense compared to his B-17, but he'd spent enough time around engines to understand the basics. Throttle, mixture, magnetos, fuel selector. The functions were universal even if the labels weren't. His hands were shaking as he started working through the startup sequence, priming the fuel pump and setting the mixture rich the way he'd seen mechanics start radial engines back in England. The engine caught on the third try with a roar that seemed loud enough to wake every German soldier within 5 miles. The big BMW radial engine coughing black smoke and then settling into a rough idle that vibrated the entire airframe. Anderson didn't wait to see if anyone had heard, because he knew they had, so he shoved the throttle forward and felt the Fw-190 lurch ahead across the grass with all the grace of a drunk elephant. He'd never used rudder pedals this sensitive, never handled a tail dragger that wanted to ground loop at the slightest provocation, but he kept the stick forward and the throttle open as the fighter bounced and shook its way down what he hoped was a runway. Muzzle flashes erupted from the hangar as German soldiers started shooting at their own plane, bullets punching through the tail section, and Anderson pulled back on the stick the second he felt the tail come up. The Fw-190 lifted off at 90 miles per hour, climbing at an angle that would have been impossible in his B-17, And suddenly he was airborne in a stolen German fighter with about 12 seconds of fighter experience and absolutely no idea where to go next. Most pilots would have turned west immediately, making a run for Allied lines before the Luftwaffe scrambled interceptors, but Anderson spotted something that changed his mind. A German convoy stretched along the road below, maybe 20 trucks loaded with supplies and soldiers, moving east toward the front lines without any air cover because they assumed the skies over Germany belonged to them. Anderson had watched German fighters strafe his bomber formations for months, had seen the damage those quick passes could do, and now he had the same capability sitting under his thumb on the control stick. Two 20mm cannons and two 13mm machine guns, all loaded and ready, all pointed at targets that had no idea an American pilot was flying overhead in a German fighter. He rolled the Fw-190 into a dive, lined up on the convoy using instincts honed from countless hours of formation flying, and pressed the firing button. The guns hammered with a sound like thunder concentrated in a metal tube, the entire plane shaking from the recoil as cannon shells and machine gun bullets tore into the convoy below. And Anderson watched trucks explode and soldiers scatter like ants as he pulled up and climbed for another pass. The Fw-190 handled like nothing he'd ever flown, responding to control inputs instantly, the engine howling as he came around for a second run, and this time he held the trigger down longer, walking his fire down the length of the convoy until his ammunition ran out and he was left with burning vehicles and complete chaos on the ground. One convoy was destroyed. 11 to go. What happened next sounds impossible, but Anderson's own after-action report confirms every detail. He flew that Fw-190 across Germany for the next 14 hours, hunting convoys like a wolf hunting sheep, using his altitude advantage and the element of surprise to hit supply columns that never expected to be attacked by their own equipment. He found convoys on roads, in towns, pulled over in forests, and every time he dove down with guns blazing until German soldiers either died or scattered. He landed twice at abandoned airstrips to refuel using German aviation fuel, figuring out the fuel caps and pumps through trial and error, and each time he took off again before anyone could respond to reports of the rogue Fw-190. The German military command was receiving frantic reports of a Focke-Wulf fighter attacking their own forces, but the reports made no sense because the plane's markings were German, the profile was German, yet it was killing German soldiers by the dozen. They thought it was mechanical malfunction, then friendly fire, then sabotage, but they never suspected an American pilot had stolen the plane and turned it into a one-man wrecking crew. By the time Anderson ran out of fuel for the third time and crash-landed the fighter in a Belgian field 20 miles behind Allied lines, he destroyed or damaged 12 separate convoys totaling over 300 vehicles. German casualty reports documented 417 soldiers killed or wounded in attacks by an unidentified Fw-190, with damage estimates exceeding 2 million Reichsmarks in destroyed equipment. Anderson walked away from the crash with a sprained ankle and a story that his own commanders initially didn't believe until German intelligence documents captured weeks later confirmed the attacks and the confusion they'd caused. The Wehrmacht had spent an entire day hunting for traitors in their own ranks, executing 3 Luftwaffe mechanics who they suspected of sabotage, never realizing the pilot attacking them was an American bomber crewman who decided that crashing in Germany wasn't going to stop him from fighting. Anderson flew 42 more missions before the war ended, eventually completing 65 combat missions total and earning the Distinguished Service Cross for the convoy attacks, though the full story remained classified for 2 years because military intelligence didn't want the Germans knowing how vulnerable their airfields were. He survived the war, went back to Iowa, and spent the rest of his life telling people that the hardest part wasn't stealing the plane or learning to fly it under fire, it was explaining to his B-17 crew, who all got captured after parachuting into Germany, why their pilot had decided to go on a one-man rampage instead of trying to escape like a sensible person. His co-pilot later said that Anderson had always been the kind of guy who saw problems as opportunities, and apparently getting shot down over Germany just looked like an opportunity to shoot back. The story of Anderson's captured Fw Fw-190 became legendary in the Army Air Forces, proof that American pilots could adapt to anything, fly anything, and fight with anything they could get their hands on. While other shot-down crews were trying to evade capture and reach neutral territory, Anderson turned his emergency into an offensive operation that caused more damage than most bombing missions, all because he refused to accept that being behind enemy lines meant he was done fighting. The Fw-190 he stole was never recovered, lost in the crash landing, but the impact of those attacks rippled through German logistics for weeks as they tried to figure out how one of their own fighters had been turned against them so effectively. By the time the war ended, the story had been confirmed through captured German documents, witness statements from rescued POWs who'd seen the burning convoys, and Anderson's own detailed debriefing where he drew diagrams of the Fw-190's cockpit from memory and explained how he'd figured out the German controls through educated guessing and pure desperation. 12 convoys destroyed. 1 stolen fighter. 14 hours of improvised combat flying in enemy territory using enemy equipment. The kind of story that sounds too crazy to be true, but the evidence proves it happened exactly the way Anderson said it did. The German High Command's response to Anderson's rampage reveals just how much chaos one stolen fighter caused behind enemy lines, because intercepted communications show they diverted 2 entire fighter squadrons from frontline duties to hunt for what they believed was a traitor pilot operating inside their own air force. They grounded dozens of Fw-190s for inspection, convinced someone had tampered with the planes, and launched an investigation that consumed thousands of man-hours while Anderson was already safely back with Allied forces drinking coffee and filling out after-action reports. The paranoia spread through Luftwaffe units across Western Germany, with pilots reporting they'd been ordered to verify their identity before every takeoff and mechanics being interrogated about who had access to parked aircraft. One German intelligence officer wrote in a report that was later captured that the incident represented a catastrophic failure of airfield security that suggests enemy infiltration at the highest levels, never imagining the real answer was simply an American pilot who saw an opportunity and took it without overthinking the impossibility of what he was attempting. What makes Anderson's achievement even more remarkable is that the Fw-190 he stole was one of Germany's most advanced fighters at the time, a plane that Luftwaffe pilots trained for months to master, and he figured out how to fly it combat effective in less than an hour through nothing but aviation instinct and the kind of desperate creativity that only comes from being shot down in enemy territory with no other options. Other Allied pilots who later flew captured Fw-190s reported that the plane was tricky to handle on takeoff, prone to torque roll if you weren't careful with the throttle, and had a tendency to snap into spins if you pulled too hard on the stick during tight maneuvers. Anderson experienced all of this while being shot at during takeoff, with no checkout flight, no instructor, no manual, just raw skill and the absolute certainty that hesitation meant death or capture. The fact that he not only survived but turned that stolen fighter into an effective weapon platform shows the kind of adaptability that defined the best American combat pilots, the ability to improvise and overcome when the textbook solution wasn't available and the only option was to make it work or die trying. Thanks for watching this story from WW2 Vault about the bomber pilot who turned a shoot-down into a shooting spree. Next week, we're covering the American tank crew that held off an entire German division for 3 days using a destroyed Sherman. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it.